I didn't come looking for a monster, I came because of a river. The little Miami doesn't announce itself the way big American rivers do. There's no roar, no wide theatrical bend that forces you to stop your car and stare. It slips through southern Ohio quietly, brown-green and patient, carrying silt, branches, old, cold things. By the time it reaches Loveland, it feels less like water and more like a boundary, something that divides without asking permission. Loveland sits where that division matters. On a map, it looks harmless. A small town pressed up against the river, a few bridges, roads that curve instead of running straight. But when you stand there, especially near the old bridges, you understand why people hesitate before crossing at night. The land dips suddenly, the trees lean inward, sound changes, tires hiss louder. Your own breathing feels intrusive, like you're disturbing something that was already listening. Before anyone ever whispered about frogs walking upright, Loveland already had a reputation not for danger, but for unease. Locals didn't describe it dramatically. They used practical language. That stretch is strange. Don't stop there after dark. The river fog gets thick fast. Fog matters here. It doesn't roll in gently. It rises. One moment you can see the bridge rails clearly, rust flaking under yellow light, and the next they dissolve into gray. The fog doesn't move like weather. It behaves like a decision. It chooses when you lose sight of the water below, when the banks disappear, when distance collapses into nothing. People forget how much American folklore is born from roads and bridges, not forests deep enough to get lost in, but transitional spaces, places meant to be passed through, not lingered in. Loveland is built around those transitions. You cross the river to get somewhere else. You slow down, even if you don't know why, and slowing down gives the night time to show itself. In the 1950s, Loveland was quieter than it is now. Fewer lights, less traffic, a place where a late-night driver could go several minutes without seeing another car. The riverbanks weren't groomed trails, yet they were rough, uneven, choked with weeds and cattails. Frogs were everywhere, big ones, loud ones, the kind that made you stop talking mid-sentence until they finished announcing themselves. That detail matters too, because when you live somewhere long enough, you stop noticing normal sounds until one night they change. Loveland's geography funnels attention downward. The road dips as it approaches the river. Your headlights angle toward the water whether you intend them to or not. Anything near the bank gets illuminated briefly, then lost again as the car continues forward. It's the perfect setup for half-seen things, perfect for moments that don't give you enough time to doubt yourself. Before the legend, people already told stories about figures near the river, but they weren't monsters. They were practical fears, drunks, trespassers, kids sneaking around where they shouldn't. Shadows that resolved into men once you got closer or didn't resolve at all. The bridges are old enough to remember those years, steel and concrete laid down when safety standards were more optimistic. They vibrate when cars pass. They hum in the cold at night. Standing still on them feels like standing on something alive, not hostile, but aware of weight, of movement, of hesitation. This is important to understand. Loveland didn't need a creature to feel wrong. It already had isolation, fog, sound distortion, and a river that swallowed reflections whole. It already trained its residents to trust their instincts without making a show of it. When someone said, "I saw something near the bridge," people didn't laugh. They asked, "Which bridge?" By the time the first true report came, before the newspapers, before the jokes, before the name Loveland was already prepared to accept something strange, not eagerly, not dramatically, but with the quiet seriousness of a place that knows what darkness can do when it's given room. That's the danger of places like this. They don't invent monsters, they make space for them. And once that space exists, it doesn't matter whether the thing that steps into it is flesh, fear, or something in between. The moment is already halfway believed before it happens. The river kept moving, the fog kept rising, the bridges kept waiting. And then, one night, a driver slowed down for reasons he couldn't explain and saw something on the far side of the road that didn't belong to the place that had prepared him so well to see it. That was when Loveland stopped being just a town by the river. It happened late enough that the road had emptied, but not so late that the night felt unreal. The man was driving alone, heading south toward Loveland, the river already close enough that the air felt damp through the cracked window. His headlights swept across the road in that familiar, narrowing cone, everything beyond it swallowed by dark. He wasn't tired. He wasn't distracted. He remembered that later, because people would ask. As he approached the bridge, he slowed, not because of traffic, because something ahead of him shifted. At first, it looked like debris, a shape near the edge of the road, low to the ground, darker than the asphalt. He lifted his foot off the accelerator, letting the car coast. The headlights caught the thing fully and the shape rose, not jumped, not lunged, rose. It came up onto two legs with an awkward deliberateness, like it wasn't built for speed but understood balance. The movement was wrong enough that his first thought wasn't animal. It wasn't human either. It was something in between, something that seemed to be remembering how to stand upright. The driver would later say the body was bulky, not tall, broad shoulders tapering into a thick torso. The skin wasn't furred. It reflected light the way wet stone does, dull and uneven. The head sat low on the shoulders, and the neck, if there was one, didn't move independently. What caught him wasn't the shape alone, it was the stillness. The creature didn't panic when the headlights hit it. It didn't freeze the way animals do. It stood there, legs slightly bent, arms hanging heavy as it besides. One hand, he was sure it was a hand, rested briefly against the guardrail as if for support. Then it turned its head. That was when he felt the cold move up his spine, not fear yet, recognition of a mistake. The face wasn't detailed. He couldn't describe eyes or a mouth with certainty. What he remembered was the width of it, the flatness, and the way it seemed to face him directly without fully lifting its head. The proportions were wrong for anything he knew, too wide, too squat, too intentional. He braked fully now, tires whispering against the road. The car stopped short of the bridge. The engine idled, loud in the silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the thing took a step back, not away from him, toward the river. Its gait was uneven but confident, like it knew exactly where the edge was. Another step, and another, until the fog swallowed its lower half. The driver watched the shoulders dip, the head vanish, and then there was nothing but mist and the sound of water moving below the bridge. He didn't follow. He didn't turn around either. He sat there longer than he could later justify, hands tied on the wheel, eyes locked on the empty space where the thing had been. When he finally drove on, he didn't slow again until he was well past town. He told two people the next day. Both asked the same question. Are you sure it wasn't a man? He considered that. He replayed the way it stood, the way it used the rail, the way it retreated without haste. No, he said. Men don't move like that. The report didn't go to a newspaper. It wasn't written down formally. It lived the way most early folklore does, passed carefully, without embellishment, because the man who saw it didn't want attention. He wanted confirmation that the river hadn't finally played tricks on him. What he got instead was silence, followed by a quiet acknowledgement from someone who lived closer to the water. You're not the first to see something down there. At the time, no one named it. No one tried to explain it. The sightings stood alone, one night, one driver, one thing that chose the river over the road. But Loveland had changed. From that point on, people didn't just slow near the bridge because of fog or curves. They slowed because they remembered a story where something stood up in the headlights, looked back, and decided the water was safer than being seen. And the river, patient as ever, kept what it was given. For several years after the first sighting, nothing happened that could be pointed to cleanly. No headlines, no second dramatic encounter that forced belief, just the slow, uneasy accumulation of small details, the kind that don't matter until they do. People near the river started mentioning sounds, not croaking, not the usual wet chorus that rolled out of the banks every summer night. These were deeper, more deliberate, single calls spaced far apart, sometimes answered from farther downriver. They carried in the fog in a way that made distance impossible to judge, a sound that felt closer than it should have been. Dogs reacted first, not all at once, not consistently, but often enough that it became noticeable. Animals tied up near the river would bark hard at nothing visible, then stop suddenly, ears back, tails low. A few refused to go near the water after dark at all. Hunters noticed it too, how game trails near certain bends of the river went cold overnight, then slowly returned days later. Still, no one said creature, not out loud. Loveland in the late 1950s was a place where people preferred explanations that fit in their hands. A drunk, a vagrant, a misidentified animal. Those explanations worked until they didn't, because the sightings, when they happened, shared things in common that made them hard to separate. Always near water, always late, always brief, and always described with the same hesitation before the important part. It stood up. One man fishing near the banks at dusk claimed he saw something squat rise from the cattails and watch him without moving. He packed up without finishing his line. Another driver swore something crossed the road ahead of him, not quickly, not running, just stepping over the asphalt and disappearing into the brush on the other side. He remembered the legs bending backward slightly, the way amphibians do, though he didn't know why that detail stuck. People didn't compare notes officially, but small towns don't need meetings to exchange information. Stories align themselves naturally. A raised eyebrow, a pause in conversation, a lowered voice. What made the pattern unsettling wasn't just the similarities, it was the restraint. No one described claws or teeth. No one claimed it attacked them. The thing was always observing or withdrawing, never chasing. That made it harder to dismiss. Predators act like predators. This didn't. It behaved like something that didn't want to be seen for long. The riverbanks themselves started showing signs that didn't quite fit the wildlife people knew. Mud disturbed and brought impressions that weren't hoof or paw. Reeds flattened in a way that suggested weight held upright, not dragged. Once a fisherman found a dead frog split open along the belly, organs removed cleanly, not chewed. That detail never reached the papers either. It lived in a single sentence passed from one person to another, then left alone. The bridges remained the focal point. Bridges are where reports sharpen because they are moved out. There's nowhere for imagination to hide when headlights lock something in place. And more than once, drivers claimed to see a shape near the railings, shorter than a man, wider than a child, watching the water below. One woman said it raised an arm when she slowed, as if shielding its eyes from the light. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. By now, the thing had a reputation without a name, a river presence, something locals referred to indirectly. You know what people have been seeing? That thing near the bridge? What no one said, but everyone felt, was that whatever it was, it understood boundaries. It didn't wander into town. It didn't appear in daylight. It stayed where water met road, where fog blurred edges, where a person could see something clearly enough to be disturbed, but not clearly enough to explain it away. That's how folklore matures. Not with screams or blood, but with repetition, with consistency, with the unsettling realization that different people at different times are describing the same behavior without knowing each other's words. By the early 1960s, Loveland had accepted a quiet truth. There was something living near the river that didn't belong to any category they had names for, and it wasn't going away. Stories can survive years without names. They can't survive without witnesses. That changed one cold night in March when a patrol car crossed the bridge just after midnight and slowed for reasons the officer couldn't immediately explain. The river was high from recent rain, dark and loud beneath the concrete span. Fog clung low to the surface, thick enough that the headlights broke it into moving walls. The officer had driven this route dozens of times before. He knew how shadows behaved here. He knew what raccoons looked like when they froze in the beams. This wasn't that. Something stood near the edge of the bridge, close enough to the railing that one wrong step would have sent it down into the water. It was facing away at first, its back broad and hunched, posture unmistakably upright. The officer eased his foot onto the brake, the cruiser rolling to a near stop. He'd later say the thing looked like it was waiting. When the headlights brightened it fully, the figure shifted. It didn't startle. It didn't flinch. It turned slowly as if reacting to a sound it had already expected. The movement was smooth, practiced, and deeply wrong for an animal that was supposed to fear vehicles. The officer reached instinctively for his spotlight. The beam washed over the figure and stayed there. What he saw forced his brain into two directions at once. The body was heavy, thick, through the chest and shoulders, but the arms were long, longer than they should have been, and bent in a way that suggested joints working differently. The legs were powerful and angled, but for spring rather than stride. The skin looked leathery, uneven, catching light in dull patches, and the head was flat, wide, almost triangular, set low with no visible neck to separate it from the torso. He couldn't make out hair. He couldn't make out ears, just a smooth, blunt shape that tilted slightly as the light settled on it. The eyes reflected, not bright like a deer's, not glowing, just a brief, wet acknowledgement that something there was looking back. The mouth, if there was a mouth, didn't open. No sound came from it. The officer stepped out of the car. That decision haunted him later. His boots hit the pavement and the figure reacted instantly, not by charging, but by shifting its weight. One arm lifted, hand spreading against the railing like a climber steadying himself. The other arm hung low, fingers curled inward, thick and webbed, looking in the beam. "Hey," the officer called, voice sharper than he meant it to be. The thing answered by turning sideways, giving him a full profile. The chest expanded as if it inhaled. Then it vaulted the railing, not clumsily, not desperately. It went over in one smooth motion, disappearing into the fog and the noise of the river below. The officer rushed forward, peering over the edge just in time to see ripples spreading wide, disturbed water cutting through the surface like something had entered cleanly and gone deep. There was no body, no thrashing, just the river swallowing sound. He stood there longer than protocol would ever allow, light sweeping the water until the fog closed ranks again. When he finally returned to the cruiser, his hands shook as he radioed in. The report he filed that night was careful, professional, sparse. Unidentified animal, approximately 4 feet tall, upright posture, left area by entering river. But reports have a way of telling the truth between the lines. Word spread faster than the paperwork, faster than anyone intended, because this time the witness wasn't a fisherman or a passing driver. It was a man trained to observe, trained to remain calm, trained to describe what he saw without embellishment. And he never changed his account. He didn't say monster, he didn't say frog, he didn't say human. He said something stood on that bridge, looked back at him, and chose the river over confrontation. From that night on, Loveland's story had an anchor, a moment people could point to and say, that's when it became real. Because when something can stand upright, react intelligently, and vanish into dark water without leaving a trace, it stops being a rumor. It becomes a resident. After the bridge incident, the river stopped being anonymous. People began attaching language to it, not officially, not in print at first, but in the way humans always do when fear needs a handle. The descriptions were still cautious, still qualified, but now they had shape. Now they had weight. Someone said it looked like a frog once. Someone else corrected them, not a frog, frog-like. That distinction mattered more than it sounded, because frogs don't stand and watch traffic. They don't brace themselves before jumping. They don't choose escape routes. By the time the story reached Cincinnati, the phrasing had shifted again. Radio hosts mentioned it jokingly during late-night segments. Columnists referred to as Loveland's little oddity, buried between weather updates and school announcements. And somewhere along that path, the name appeared, the Loveland Frog. It was said lightly at first, with a smile, as if humor could blunt the edge of the thing. Names do that. They domesticate fear. They turn uncertainty into something you can talk about without lowering your voice. But the name didn't shrink it. It sharpened it. Because once a thing is named, people begin looking for it. Reports increased, not because the creature was more active, but because attention had finally been given permission. Anglers claimed to see movement along the banks where there hadn't been before. Teenagers drove out late, daring each other to cross the bridge slowly, headlights sweeping the railings in exaggerated arcs. Most found nothing. A few found enough. One man returning from a late shift swore he saw 3 figures crouched near the waterline, their shapes and shapes broken by reeds and shadow when his headlights caught them. 2 slipped immediately into the river. The third lingered just long enough to rise to its full height before following. He didn't stop. He didn't report it. He told his brother weeks later over a beer that never again. That detail, the possibility of more than one, made its way through town in fragments. No one wanted to examine it too closely. A solitary anomaly is unsettling. A population is something else entirely. Meanwhile, skepticism fought back. Biologists were coded. Herpetologists dismissed it as misidentification. Large frogs distorted by light, injured animals moving oddly, imagination filling gaps in poor visibility. One suggested escaped iguanas. Another laughed outright. Those explanations worked fine on paper. They failed at the river because the people who had seen it agreed on something that didn't fit animals or pranks. The way it held itself, the balance, the deliberate stillness, the sense that it wasn't startled to be observed, it was annoyed. The Loveland Frog didn't behave like prey. It behaved like something aware of its environment and confident enough to wait before moving. And always, always it returned to the water. No footprints ever led away from the river into town. No tracks crossed fields or roads beyond the immediate banks. It respected its boundary, or perhaps it needed it. That idea that the river wasn't just a habitat but a requirement quieted some fears while deepening others. If the water was keeping it there, what happened when the river flooded? When the banks changed? When bridges were repaired and the flow redirected? Folklore adapts to uncertainty. It begins to answer questions no one asks about out loud. By the late 1960s, parents warned children not to linger near the river after dark, not with ghost stories or monsters, but with a vague caution that felt older than the town itself. Stay away from the water at night. They didn't say why. They didn't need to, because by then everyone knew the name. And once a thing has a name, it stops being hypothetical. It becomes something you wait to see again. By the time summer came, the sightings had settled into something almost predictable. Not frequent, not regular, but patterned in a way that made the river feel watched. The reports clustered around the same stretches of water, near bends where the current slowed, under bridges where shadow lingered longest, along muddy banks where reeds grew thick enough to hide movement until it was too late to ignore. People who spent time near the river began to feel it before they saw anything, a tightening in the air, a sense of being observed without any obvious source. Animals reacted first. Dogs refused to approach certain spots, pulling against their leashes, whinnying low in their throats. Livestock near the river grew restless at night, banging against fences, gathering away from the water even during heat when instinct should have drawn them closer. Birds went silent in pockets, as if the sound had been scooped out of the air. None of this proved anything, but it repeated. A fisherman described hearing something enter the water behind him without a splash, just a heavy displacement, like a body sliding beneath the surface rather than falling in. He turned too late to see what caused it. All that remained were spreading rings and the sudden awareness that whatever had been there had waited until his attention drifted. Another witness claimed the thing watched him from the opposite bank for nearly a full minute. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It crouched low, arms resting on its knees, posture eerily relaxed. When the man finally shouted, the figure stood, straightened fully, and stepped backward into the river as if descending stairs no one else could see. Always the water. That consistency became harder to dismiss than the sightings themselves. Whatever the Loveland Frog was, or whatever people were seeing, it wasn't wandering aimlessly. It wasn't roaming neighborhoods or fields. It stayed close to the river as if tethered to it, emerging only when conditions felt right. Some suggested it hunted there. Others suggested it hid. A few quieter voices wondered if the river was a boundary rather than a shelter, something it could cross but preferred not to. Theories multiplied, mutated amphibians, relic species, hoaxes layered on top of genuine animal encounters. Each explanation accounted for one detail and failed on three others. None explained the posture, none explained the patience, and none explained the eyes. Those who saw them struggled to describe the feeling afterward. Not fear exactly, more like the aftermath of an interruption, like walking in on a conversation that stopped the moment you arrived. Witnesses reported trouble sleeping, dreams of water rising around them, of standing on riverbanks while something waited just out of sight. No injuries were ever linked directly to the sightings, no attacks, no evidence of aggression. But there was no friendliness either. The Loveland Frog did not approach people. It tolerated them briefly, acknowledged them, and withdrew. That restraint unsettled more than violence would have. Predators charge or flee. This thing assessed. By late summer, people who lived near the river began altering routines without fully admitting why. Evening walks ended earlier. Fishing trips shortened. Kids were called home before dusk. Voices tied with urgency that didn't match the casual tone of the warning. The river itself seemed unchanged, still flowing, still loud after rain, still carrying debris downstream, but something about it felt occupied, as if it was no longer just water moving through town, but a corridor, a place of passage, a place where something else passed through occasionally, leaving only disturbed silence behind. And with each quiet night that followed another report, one thought settled deeper into the town's collective mind. If the Loveland Frog was being seen this often without incident, it wasn't because it could not do harm. It was because it chose not to, for now.